Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. Story 1. The First Imprint. It started on a dreary November evening when the first of the tiny handprints appeared. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, wiping away the condensation from a scalding shower, when I noticed it, a faint, child-sized handprint on the lower corner of the glass. At first, I dismissed it as an odd pattern left by the steam, perhaps some leftover residue from the cleaning products I used earlier. But as I leaned in closer, the unmistakable ridges of small fingers became clearer. My heart skipped a beat, but I quickly pushed the thought aside, convincing myself that I was imagining things. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was off. The handprints began appearing more frequently, not just in the bathroom, but on other mirrors around the house, my bedroom, the hallway, even the kitchen. Each time, they were slightly smudged, as if left by a child who had been playing nearby. But there was no child in my home. I lived alone, and I had never had kids. One night, after an exhausting day at work, I came home to find the mirrors in my living room covered with dozens of these tiny handprints, all perfectly formed and arranged in a haphazard pattern as though a child had been frantically trying to get my attention. The sight of it sent a cold shiver down my spine, and for the first time, I felt genuinely frightened. Who, or what, could be leaving these prints? I had no answers, only a growing sense of dread. The next day, I decided to call my sister, Amy, who lived in the city. We hadn't spoken much since she moved away, but she had always been sensitive to the supernatural. "Maybe you should get someone to cleanse the house," she suggested cautiously after I explained what was happening. "It sounds like you might have a spirit there, and not a friendly one." Her words echoed in my mind long after we hung up. I wanted to dismiss the idea, but the more I thought about it, the more plausible it seemed. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I kept thinking about Amy's suggestion and wondered if there was indeed something otherworldly in my home. As I lay there in the dark, I swore I could hear faint whispers, too soft to make out but close enough to send my heart racing. When I finally drifted off to sleep, I was plagued by nightmares of small, pale hands reaching out to me from the shadows, pulling me into a cold, dark place. I woke up in a sweat, gasping for breath. The room was cold, colder than it should have been. As I looked around, my eyes were drawn to the mirror across from my bed. There, illuminated by the dim light of the moon, were two small, perfectly formed handprints, right where my face had been moments before. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. The morning after those haunting dreams, I felt a heavy weight in my chest as I went about my routine. The handprints had disappeared by dawn, leaving only the unsettling memory of their presence. I couldn't bring myself to mention it to anyone, not even Amy. Instead, I spent hours scouring the internet for explanations, reading stories of haunted houses and malevolent spirits, hoping to find something that matched what I was experiencing. But nothing I found seemed to fit. The handprints were too small, too innocent looking for any of the terrifying entities described in those articles. Days turned into weeks, and the handprints continued to appear with increasing frequency. No matter how much I cleaned the mirrors, they always returned, sometimes even larger, as if the small hands were growing. The whispers I heard at night grew louder, more distinct, but always just beyond the edge of comprehension. It felt like a game, some unseen force toying with me, driving me slowly mad. One evening, after another restless day, I decided to stay up late, determined to catch whatever was behind the handprints in the act. I set up a chair in the hallway, positioning myself so I could see the mirror clearly. The house was deathly quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath me. I sat there for hours, watching, waiting. Just as I was beginning to nod off, I heard it, a soft giggle, unmistakably that of a child. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the darkened hallway. The giggle came again, this time from the direction of the mirror. I stared at my reflection, frozen in place, until I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Behind my reflection, in the shadowy corner of the hallway, was the outline of a small figure. It was barely visible, just a shape in the dark, but it was there, and it was moving toward me. I jumped up, flipping on the hallway light, but the figure was gone. I stood there, my breath coming in short gasps, staring at the now empty space. The only evidence that anything had been there was a single handprint on the mirror, larger than any I'd seen before. I stumbled back into my bedroom, locking the door behind me as if that could keep whatever it was out. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the edge of my bed, clutching a flashlight, too terrified to close my eyes. The following day, I called Amy again, my voice shaking as I recounted what had happened. "It's not just a spirit," she said, her tone serious. "There's something else, something dark. You need to get help, now." She gave me the number of a friend who specialized in the paranormal, someone she trusted. I hesitated, not wanting to believe that my situation had escalated to this point, but I knew deep down that I had no choice. When I called the number, a woman with a calm, soothing voice answered. Her name was Evelyn, and she agreed to come by that evening to assess the situation. As I waited for her arrival, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every mirror in the house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the surfaces warping and twisting as if something was trying to push through. When Evelyn finally arrived, she was an older woman with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. She walked through the house with a quiet determination, stopping in front of each mirror and murmuring words I couldn't understand. "There's something here," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something ancient, something angry. It's using the mirrors as a gateway, but it's not just the mirrors, it's you it wants." Evelyn's words echoed in my mind long after she said them. "It's you it wants." I couldn't comprehend why or how, but the sense of dread that had been gnawing at me for weeks now coiled tighter around my chest. She continued to inspect the mirrors, her face growing grimmer with each one she examined. Finally, she stopped in front of the largest mirror in my living room, the one that had first shown the multitude of handprints. "This one is the strongest," she muttered, her fingers lightly brushing the edges of the mirror's frame. "It's more than just a portal, it's a beacon. Whatever's trying to come through is being drawn to you, feeding off your fear." She paused and then added, "But there's more. I can feel something familiar, almost like..." Her voice trailed off as she stared into the glass. I took a step closer, my heart pounding. "Almost like what?" I asked, my voice trembling. Evelyn turned to me, her expression a mix of concern and confusion. "It's as if this entity has a personal connection to you. I don't know how, but it's not just a random spirit. It knows you, or at least thinks it does. The handprints, they're its way of trying to reach out, but what it wants from you, I can't say." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I racked my brain, trying to think of any possible explanation. I had no connection to the paranormal, no history with anything like this. But then, a memory surfaced, a memory I had buried deep and forgotten for years. It was of a childhood friend, someone I had known briefly but intensely. We had played together in the woods near my childhood home, always away from prying eyes. He had been a strange, quiet boy, with pale skin and eyes that seemed too old for his small face. I remember the day he stopped coming to play, how his absence had left me feeling hollow. Could it be him? I whispered, more to myself than to Evelyn. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Who?" I explained the memory, the strange boy who had vanished from my life without a trace. I had never known what happened to him, no one had, really. He had simply disappeared, leaving behind a void I had filled with other friends, other memories. As I spoke, a chill crept over me. The handprints, the size, the height, they matched the memory of those small hands, always clutching mine as we played. Evelyn listened intently, her face serious. "It's possible," she said slowly, "that his spirit, or whatever was attached to him, has been trying to reconnect with you. But something went wrong. It's not the child you remember, at least not entirely. Spirits can change, especially when they linger too long in this world." I was silent, my mind reeling from this revelation. If it was him, if his spirit had somehow latched onto me, then I was the cause of all of this. But what did he want? Why now, after all these years? As if in answer, the mirror in front of us began to fog over, just as it had in the bathroom on that first night. But this time, it was different. The fog swirled, forming shapes, until the unmistakable outline of a face appeared, pale, with hollow eyes and a sad, twisted smile. It was him, or what remained of him. He looked at me through the glass, his gaze penetrating deep into my soul. And then, as if whispering directly into my mind, I heard his voice, faint but clear, you promised you'd never leave me." I stumbled back, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The room seemed to spin, the air thick with an oppressive energy. Evelyn stepped forward, placing herself between me and the mirror. "This is not the child you remember," she said firmly. "This is something darker, something twisted by time and sorrow. We have to act quickly before it fully manifests." But before she could move, the lights flickered, and the entire house was plunged into darkness. The last thing I saw was the twisted smile in the mirror, growing wider, more menacing. The darkness that engulfed the house was absolute, a thick, oppressive void that swallowed everything. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled for my phone, its faint screen the only source of light. Evelyn's voice cut through the pitch black, steady and commanding, "Stay close to me. Whatever you do, don't look into the mirrors." But it was too late. The mirrors were the only source of light now, glowing faintly in the darkness, each one displaying that same twisted smile, that familiar face that was no longer comforting but malevolent. The air grew colder with every passing second, and I could feel the presence tightening around me, a suffocating grip that made it hard to breathe. Evelyn began chanting something in a language I didn't recognize, her voice firm and rhythmic, but the entity in the mirrors only seemed to grow stronger. The whispers that had haunted me for weeks returned, louder now, echoing through the house with a manic glee. The small handprints started to appear again, not just on the mirrors but on the walls, the floors, even the windows. Everywhere I looked, those tiny, accusing handprints followed me, growing closer with each breath. "You promised." The voice was louder now, reverberating through my mind, seeping into my very bones. It was no longer just a whisper, it was a demand, filled with a sorrowful rage that made my heart ache. I clutched my head, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The memories flooded back, every moment with that boy, every promise we had made to each other as children, promises of friendship, of never leaving one another behind. I had broken that promise, and now it was time to pay. "Fight it," Evelyn shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of voices. "Don't let it in." But it was already too late. I could feel the entity's presence growing stronger inside me, rooting itself deep within my soul. The mirrors began to crack, spider webs of fractures spreading across their surfaces as if the glass itself was trying to contain the force behind it. I felt a cold, small hand grip mine, not physically but in a way that was even more terrifying, in my mind, in my heart. It was as though he was pulling me into the darkness with him, and no matter how much I struggled, I couldn't break free. The last of the mirrors shattered, the sound deafening in the stillness of the house. Shards of glass exploded outward, but instead of falling to the floor, they hung in the air, suspended by an unseen force. The reflections in the shards no longer showed me or Evelyn, they showed the boy, now fully manifested, his face twisted with pain and longing. His eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I understood what he wanted. He wasn't seeking revenge. He wasn't trying to harm me. He was trying to bring me back to him, to the place where I had left him so long ago, a place between worlds, where time had no meaning and the bonds of our childhood promises still held fast. The boy was no longer just a ghost, he was something more, something that had waited for far too long and had become twisted in the waiting. He was desperate, and that desperation was pulling me under. Evelyn's chanting grew louder, more frantic, but I knew in my heart that it was too late. The house around us seemed to dissolve, the walls fading into shadows as the world grew colder and darker. The boy's hand was no longer just in my mind, I could feel it, icy and solid, gripping mine with a strength that belied its small size. "Come with me," his voice whispered one last time, and with that, the darkness closed in completely. I felt myself falling, sinking deeper into the void where he waited. The last thing I heard before the cold took over was Evelyn's voice, distant and fading. "No. Fight it." Don't let him." But her words were lost as the darkness embraced me, pulling me into a place where promises were never broken, and where the past had a grip that could never be escaped. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Fingers at My Window. I used to love the sound of rain tapping against my bedroom window. It was a soothing melody that lulled me to sleep, even on the darkest nights. The steady patter was like nature's lullaby, calming my restless mind after long days at work. I never gave much thought to it, the rain. It was just rain, after all, until it wasn't. The night it all began, the rain was heavier than usual, the kind that rattled the roof and drenched the earth in a relentless downpour. I had just settled into bed, pulling the thick quilt up to my chin as the familiar sound of raindrops began their usual dance on the glass. But that night, something felt different. There was a new rhythm to the rain, a distinct pattern that I hadn't noticed before. At first, I brushed it off as nothing more than the wind, pushing the droplets in erratic directions. But then, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, almost deliberate. I sat up, blinking against the darkness, straining to hear beyond the walls of my room. The tapping continued, now clearer than ever, as though someone, or something, was pressing their fingers against the glass, drumming with a purpose. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The rational part of my brain tried to dismiss it. Just the wind, just the rain. But there was a gnawing fear in my gut that told me otherwise. "Who's there?" I whispered into the shadows, half hoping for silence, half expecting an answer. But the only response was the persistent tapping, as if mocking my fear. I hesitated, debating whether to approach the window. My heartbeat quickened, the thud of it almost louder than the rain. Summoning whatever courage I had left, I swung my legs out of bed and crept towards the window, each step heavier than the last. As I reached for the curtain, the tapping stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening, more terrifying than the sound itself. I froze, my hand inches from the fabric, my breath caught in my throat. The room was still, but the air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain, half expecting to see nothing but the storm outside. But what I saw made my blood run cold. There were handprints on the glass, dozens of them, smeared and glistening as though fresh. They weren't human, long, bony fingers with too many joints, twisted in unnatural directions. They covered the entire window, as if whatever had made them was desperate to get in. I stumbled back, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The rain had masked the true nature of the sound, and now that the illusion was shattered, I couldn't unsee it. The tapping started again, this time louder, faster, urgent. I turned and ran from the room, heart pounding, but the sound followed me, echoing in my ears no matter how far I went. The fingers weren't just at my window anymore, they were everywhere. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, with the knowledge that something was out there, pressing its deformed hands against my window? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those twisted fingers, felt the cold dread seep into my bones. The tapping had stopped once I fled the room, but the silence was no comfort. It only meant that whatever was outside had gotten what it wanted, my fear. The next morning, I forced myself to go back to the window, convinced that the night had been some sort of fevered nightmare. But the handprints were still there, stark against the glass, as though they had been burned into the surface. I wiped at them with a trembling hand, but they wouldn't come off. I considered calling someone, anyone, but who would believe me? Who could help with something like this? I wasn't even sure what this was. Over the following days, I tried to avoid my bedroom as much as possible. I slept on the couch, worked late, and kept the television on at all hours to drown out the sound of rain, which had become a constant presence. It was as if the storm had taken up permanent residence above my house, the downpour never ceasing, never relenting. But the tapping, it found me wherever I went. It started in the bedroom, but soon it spread to every window in the house. No matter where I hid, the sound followed, growing louder with each passing night. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was outside. Maybe if I confronted it, the madness would stop. Desperation had dulled my fear, leaving only a cold determination. On the 7th night of the rain, I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the door. The storm raged on, but I didn't care. I needed answers. The night air was thick with mist, swirling in the light of my torch. It felt alive, almost sentient, wrapping around me like cold, clammy hands. The rain pelted down, obscuring everything beyond a few feet in front of me, but I kept going, forcing my way through the darkness. I knew the source of the tapping had to be close. It had to be here, somewhere in the thick of the storm. As I moved further from the house, the mist grew thicker, the air heavier. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle. The flashlight flickered, its beam cutting through the fog in fits and starts. And then, just on the edge of the light, I saw them, the faces. They were barely there, more shadows than solid, but unmistakable. Eyes, dozens of them, stared back at me from the swirling mist, unblinking and hungry. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, with hollow cheeks and wide, gaping mouths that moved soundlessly in the dark. I staggered back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The faces followed, pushing closer, as if drawn to my fear. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The mist swirled tighter, the faces closing in. And then, from the shadows, a voice answered, low and rasping, like the wind through dead leaves. "We were invited," it hissed, and as the words filled the air, the realization hit me with the force of a sledgehammer. I had invited them in. I had been so desperate to hear the rain, to find comfort in its familiar sound, that I had ignored the warnings, the signs. I had welcomed them, these things, into my home, and now they weren't leaving. The tapping began again, louder than before, coming from all around me. The faces in the mist pressed closer, their mouths stretching into grotesque grins. I turned and ran, but the sound followed me, relentless, inescapable. I had brought this upon myself, and there was no escaping it. I barely made it back to the house, slamming the door behind me as if it could keep out the terror that now clung to my every breath. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, but it was no use. I knew, deep down, that no door or wall could keep them out. The faces in the mist, the tapping fingers, they were part of me now, part of the world I had foolishly invited into my life. I stumbled into the living room, collapsing onto the couch. The rain beat harder against the windows, more violent than ever before. I couldn't think, couldn't focus. My mind raced with questions, with fear. What were they? Why had they come to me? And, most terrifying of all, what did they want? I spent hours trying to make sense of it, but the answers eluded me. The tapping continued, relentless, echoing through the house until it became a constant, maddening drone in my ears. My thoughts drifted back to the nights when it all started, trying to recall every detail, every fleeting moment that might explain what had gone so horribly wrong. Then, I remembered something, an old book I had found at a second-hand shop a few weeks before. It had been tucked away on a dusty shelf, its leather cover cracked with age. The title had intrigued me, Whispers of the Beyond. I had bought it on a whim, thinking it might be a good read for the rainy nights ahead. But as I tried to remember what I had read, a cold realization began to creep over me. The book had been filled with strange, ancient rituals, rites that promised to grant the reader a connection with the other side. It had all seemed like nonsense, the kind of thing that might pass for entertainment but was never meant to be taken seriously. But I had tried one of the rituals, thinking it might be fun, a way to feel a little thrill on a dull evening. I had lit the candles, whispered the incantations, and, for a moment, felt nothing but foolish. But then, that night, the rain had started, and the tapping had begun. I bolted upright, the book's sinister implications crashing down on me. I had called them. The fingers, the faces, they were the result of my careless experiment. Panic set in. I raced to my bedroom, tearing through the clutter on my desk until I found the book, its pages yellowed and brittle. Flipping frantically through it, I searched for anything that might offer a way to reverse what I had done. My hands shook as I found the passage I needed. It spoke of a way to sever the connection, to send the spirits back to where they belonged, but the ritual was far more complex than the one I had performed. There were warnings, grave ones, about the consequences of failure. The words seemed to blur before my eyes, the letters twisting and writhing like the faces in the mist. I could barely make sense of them. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a brief, terrifying moment. When the lights came back on, the book had fallen from my hands, its pages fanned out across the floor. I scrambled to gather them, but as I did, I noticed something strange. Some of the pages were missing, torn out. My heart sank. The most critical part of the ritual was gone. Frustration and fear mixed into a potent brew of desperation. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if the fingers were inside the house now, clawing at the walls, the floors, the very air around me. I couldn't breathe. I had no way out, no way to stop what I had started. The storm outside intensified, the rain pounding like fists against the roof, the wind howling with an unnatural fury. I realized then that the storm wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside me. I had become part of it, in it of me. The fingers, the faces, they weren't visitors, they were taking root, growing stronger with each passing second. And I, foolishly thinking I could control the forces I had summoned, was losing myself to them. In the depths of my despair, a single thought pierced through the terror: if I couldn't stop them, I could at least try to contain them. The final pages of the book, the ones that remained, spoke of a binding ritual, something that could trap the spirits, but only for a time. It was dangerous, fraught with peril, but it was my only hope. But I would have to act quickly, before the storm consumed me completely. The storm outside reached a fever pitch, the wind screaming like 1,000 tortured souls, the rain slamming against the house as if it were trying to tear it apart. Inside, the tapping was no longer just a sound, it had become a force, a pressure that bore down on me, driving me to the brink of madness. The fingers were everywhere now, scratching at the walls, sliding under doors, wrapping around the edges of the windows. They were inside my mind, relentless and hungry. I knew I had no time to waste. The binding ritual was my only chance, however slim. The instructions were incomplete, the critical pages torn away, but I had no choice. I gathered what remained of the book and hurried to the center of the living room, where I had cleared a space on the floor. The candles from the first ritual were still there, their wicks charred but unburned. I lit them quickly, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the matches. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with an oppressive energy that seemed to pulse in time with my racing heart. I felt the presence of the spirits closing in, the fingers tapping out an impatient rhythm as they waited for me to make my move. The faces in the mist, invisible but felt, loomed just beyond the edges of my consciousness, their eyes burning into me. There was no turning back now. I began to chant the words from the book, stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables, my voice wavering with fear. The room seemed to contract around me, the walls pressing in, the light from the candles flickering wildly. The tapping grew louder, faster, as if the fingers were drumming on my very skull. I pushed on, forcing the words out, desperate to complete the ritual before the spirits overwhelmed me. As I spoke the final incantation, the candles flared, their flames leaping high, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The pressure in the room intensified, and for a moment, I thought I had done it, that I had succeeded in binding the spirits, trapping them where they could no longer harm me. But then, the flames sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The tapping stopped. For a brief, breathless moment, there was silence. The air was still, the storm outside suddenly muted, as if the world had been put on pause. I held my breath, waiting, hoping that the ritual had worked. But in the darkness, I felt a presence, stronger than before, more solid, more real. It wasn't just the fingers anymore. It was something far worse. The mist began to seep into the room, curling around my feet, cold and damp. The faces emerged from the shadows, more defined now, their features sharper, more human yet grotesquely distorted. They moved with purpose, no longer bound to the mist, no longer just echoes of something otherworldly. They were here, with me, in my home, in my mind. And they were angry. The ritual hadn't bound them, it had unleashed them. I backed away, tripping over the scattered pages of the book, my mind a whirlwind of terror. The faces advanced, their mouths twisted into sneers, eyes glinting with malice. I realized too late that the binding ritual, incomplete as it was, had only served to give them form, to make them real in a way they hadn't been before. They were free now, free to do whatever they pleased. And I was their target. I turned and ran, but there was nowhere to go. The fingers found me, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me down. The faces closed in, their breath cold against my skin, their voices a cacophony of whispers, promises of pain and suffering. I screamed, but no sound came out, my voice stolen by the darkness. They were all around me, inside me, tearing at my mind, my soul. In the last moments before the darkness claimed me, I realized the horrible truth: I had not invited them in. They had always been here, waiting, watching, feeding off my fear, growing stronger with each tap against the window. The rain had never been rain, it had always been fingers, always been them, trying to break through, to take what was theirs. And now they had. The fingers at my window have taken me. The tapping has stopped. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.